For 5 years, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast carried a worn coffee shop coaster in the inside pocket of his jacket, right over his heart. On the back, written in a woman's handwriting, was a single word: Lena. He never explained it to anyone. He never threw it away. And then one morning, the woman whose name he had been carrying across 2 continents walked through his mother's front door, holding his daughter's hand. This channel tells the stories behind the power: mafia empires, buried love, and the families that survive it all. What this story teaches us: some people leave not because they stopped loving, but because they loved too much and chose the wrong way to protect it. Like this video if that stayed with you. Share it, leave a comment, and subscribe because we post a new story every single day.
Catherine Kensington did not raise her voice. She had no reason to. Instead, her voice became quiet, slow, and dangerously calm. Every word landed like a cold, smooth stone on the marble floor. "What did you just say?" Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits, sharp as a surgeon's knife, as she looked Lena up and down, from her worn-out shoes to her pale, frightened face. There was no shock in her gaze. There was only the ice-cold assessment of a woman who had stood beside the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast for 40 years. A woman who was used to dealing with all kinds of threats. "I will ask you one more time," Catherine said, taking a single step closer to Lena. The scent of her expensive perfume filled the air, but there was nothing soft about her stare. "What did you just say about my son?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat feeling as dry and scratchy as sandpaper. She knew she had just kicked open a door that could never be closed again. The words she spoke were still hanging in the air, too heavy to ever take back. "Ma'am, I know this has to sound very," Lena started, her voice trembling before she forced it to be steady. "Sound very what? Insane? Desperate?" Catherine interrupted her. And now her voice held something even scarier than rage. It was pure, controlled disgust. "You have been inside this house for less than 1 hour, and you have the audacity to stand before me and claim that my son, Jude Kensington, is the father of your child." She moved even closer. Lena felt an urge to step back, but her legs refused to cooperate. "People who try to scam my family tend to have very unhappy endings," Catherine said, her voice as smooth as silk, but her words felt like a death sentence. "I have seen every type of person show up at this door with every kind of sob story, all of them hoping to get a little money from the Kensington family. If that is what you are trying to do, I advise you to stop this little act right now while I am still being polite." Lena recognized the threat for what it was. This was not the idle warning of a rich woman annoyed by a disrespectful maid. This was the calm order of someone who was used to people obeying her and used to making those who defied her simply disappear. But Lena had lived for 27 years without anyone to protect her. She had slept in the back of an old car when she was 16. She had given birth all by herself in a city hospital without anyone there to hold her hand. She was no stranger to fear, and she understood that the real danger was not the woman in front of her. The real danger was letting the truth that was burning inside her go unspoken. "I am not trying to get money from you," Lena said. Her voice was shaking, but she met Catherine's gaze without flinching. "I had no idea who you were before I came here this morning. I did not know whose house this was. All I know is that the man in that painting is the man I fell in love with for 3 months, 5 years ago. He told me his name was Jack. He would come into the cafe where I worked every single morning and order a black coffee, no sugar. He would laugh at his own terrible jokes. He would run his hand through his hair whenever he got flustered, and he would kiss me on the forehead every morning right before he left." Lena's voice cracked on the final words, but she fought back the tears, refusing to seem weak in front of this woman. And then one day, he was just gone. No explanation, no note. His phone number was disconnected. It was like he never existed. She took a shaky breath. 6 weeks after that, I found out I was pregnant. I tried to find him. I looked everywhere. But all I had was a fake name and the memory of a man who I now realize was not who he pretended to be. Catherine stood there, perfectly still. Her expression did not change at all. But Lena noticed a tiny shift deep in her eyes. It was not belief, not even close, but it was focus. It was the kind of intense focus you see when someone stops waiting for their turn to talk and starts truly listening. My daughter's name is Phoebe, Lena continued, her voice growing stronger now, as if just saying her child's name gave her courage. She is 4 years and 3 months old. I have raised her completely on my own since the day she was born. I had no help, no family, no one. It has just been me and my little girl. I did not come to this house to search for my daughter's father. I came here for a job that pays 3 times what the cafe did, because my daughter deserves to have enough food to eat every single day. Lena paused to catch her breath. Seeing him in that painting was a complete shock. It was an accident that I truly wish had never happened. The room became completely quiet. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, casting long stripes of light across the expensive Persian rug. The only sound was the steady ticking of a grandfather clock, marking time in the heavy silence between the two women. Catherine stared at Lena for what felt like an eternity. She was no longer sizing her up. She was rearranging facts in her head, comparing what she had just heard to what she already knew, trying to find a lie in the story and failing. Finally, she turned, walked over to a deep blue velvet couch, and sat down. Her posture was still perfectly straight, but her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit. It was a small change, but it was enough for Lena to see that a crack had appeared in her perfect armor. "Sit down," Catherine said. Her voice was still icy, but the sharp edge was gone. It had changed into something different, something like the tone a seasoned detective uses when she starts to think the person she is questioning might actually be telling the truth. "Start at the beginning. Tell me everything. Do not leave a single thing out." So Lena told her the whole story. She remembered every little detail. Rosie's cafe in the South End, right on the corner by the train station. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning mixing with the steam coming off the wet streets. Jack, who she now knew was Jude, would always show up at 7:30 in the morning. He was never a minute early or a minute late, as if he lived his life by a stopwatch. He always chose the same table, the little one right by the window. He always got the same drink, a black coffee with no sugar. And he would always look at her with those intense gray-blue eyes when she served him. It was a look that made her hands shake so much in the first week that she was afraid she would spill the hot coffee all over him. Catherine listened to every word without saying anything. She sat as still as a marble statue on that blue couch. Only her eyes moved, scanning every single expression on Lena's face, searching for any hint of a lie. When Lena was finished, the room was quiet once again. Catherine stood up, walked to a beautiful oak cabinet by the window, and opened the second drawer. She pulled out a photo album bound in brown leather. It was not a fancy album meant for guests to see. This one was personal. The leather on the corners was worn down, and the binding was a little loose. She set it on the coffee table right in front of Lena without a word. Lena looked from the album to Catherine, unsure of what to do. "Open it," Catherine commanded, her voice sharp and direct. Lena opened the cover to the first page, and she gasped. This was not the serious, formal man from the painting on the wall. This was Jude as he really was. This was the Jude she had known as Jack. In the first picture, he was on a beach in Cape Cod, wearing a simple white t-shirt and shorts, smiling as he squinted into the bright sun. In the next photo, he was sitting at a bar, holding a glass of beer. Model, hand, and his head was tilted back a little while he laughed at something somebody said. Next was a birthday picture. He was standing in front of a cake, the candlelight reflecting in his gray-blue eyes. And that smile, it was leaning just a bit to the left, looking a little shy, like he wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. Lena stopped at a photo from the beach, her finger gently brushing the protective glass. That smile always tilts to the left, and he squints in the sun instead of putting on sunglasses. She flipped the page and paused at a picture from a bar. Look at how he holds his drink, always with his left hand, even though he is right-handed. And whenever he really laughs, he throws his head back and then smooths his hair down because he gets embarrassed. Lena's voice started to shake. My daughter does the exact same things. Phoebe runs a hand through her hair when she gets nervous. She tilts her head back when she laughs. And she is only 4 years old. She makes these gestures that she has never seen anyone else make, because the one person who moves just like her vanished before she was even born. Catherine remained silent the whole time Lena went through the album. But Lena saw that the woman's hand, which had been resting peacefully in her lap, was now clenched around the edge of her blazer. Her knuckles were completely white. It was the single detail that gave away Catherine Kensington's real feelings. Then she got up, took her phone out of her pocket, and dialed a number from memory. Brennan. Her voice was cold as steel again. I need you to run a background check. The name is Lena Ashford, 27 years old. I want every single detail from 6 years ago until today. Where she has lived, her jobs, medical records, all of it. I expect the results before the end of the night. She hung up and looked back at Lena, her expression unreadable, as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than a standard business call. You will go back to your duties now, Catherine ordered. Mrs. Patton is waiting for you in the east hallway. You will complete your shift like normal. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, is to know about this conversation, not Mrs. Patton, not a single person on staff in this house, and not anyone outside that door. Lena got to her feet, her legs still feeling weak. She simply nodded. Catherine moved in closer, so close that Lena could make out the delicate veins on the back of the woman's hand from how long she had been squeezing it. And Lena, she said, saying her name for the first time instead of calling her girl or the new girl. The way she said it had a heaviness Lena could not quite understand. If this report shows that you are lying about even the smallest thing, you will deeply regret ever walking through those iron gates. The rest of the day felt like a hazy dream Lena could not escape from. She trailed Mrs. Patton down the east corridor, listening to the housekeeper detail the cleaning routine for every room, which polish to use on the oak floors, which on the marble, and how to fold the bath towels into a perfect fan, the Kensington way. Lena nodded, committed it to memory, and repeated instructions when she was asked. But her thoughts were a whirlwind, bouncing between the oil painting, Catherine's icy stare, and the gray-blue eyes she saw every single day in her own daughter's face. Are you feeling okay, Mrs. Patton asked after Lena fumbled the dust cloth for the third time in 10 minutes. You look a bit distracted. I am so sorry, Lena said, grabbing it and forcing a smile. It is just my first day, so I am a little nervous. Mrs. Patton gave her an understanding nod and did not ask any more questions. She was the type of person who knew when to give her space, and Lena was thankful for that. Around noon, Mrs. Patton guided Lena up to the second floor, toward the master suite. This is Mr. Jude's room, she explained, easing open a heavy oak door. He is currently in London, but Mrs. Kensington insists it be kept spotless, as though he could return at any second. Lena walked in and felt an immediate change in the atmosphere. The room was spacious, but shockingly simple compared to the luxury in the rest of the house. There was a king-size bed with a dark wooden frame, 2 nightstands that held only lamps, and a mahogany desk near the window that looked out onto the garden. On the desk sat a closed laptop and a picture frame that was turned face down. This was the room of someone trying to disappear, or perhaps someone who was being erased, Mrs. Patton told her to change the linens and dust all the surfaces, then went to check on another part of the house, telling Lena to finish her work and lock the door behind her. Alone now, Lena moved with caution, as if she were walking through a minefield. Her hands shook as she pulled the sheets from the bed, and when a familiar scent rose from the pillow, she had to freeze, clutching the fabric with her eyes shut. wood and bergamot. It was Jack's scent, the one she had inhaled every night sleeping beside him in their tiny Dorchester apartment. The same scent she had desperately searched for on her own pillows for months after he disappeared, until it finally faded, and she had to accept he was gone for good. And now, here it was, perfectly preserved and fresh, as if 5 years had never passed at all. Lena willed herself to get back to work, change the sheets, dust the furniture, straighten up. When she got to the desk, she carefully wiped around the laptop and the picture frame, pretending she needed to clean behind it. She picked the frame up. The photo showed Jude with his parents at what looked like a graduation. Someone was handing him a diploma. Catherine stood to his right with a surprisingly genuine smile, while a tall man with a severe expression, who Lena figured was Raymond Kensington, stood on his left. But it was not the photograph that made her heart stop. It was what had been tucked behind it. A small, round piece of cardboard, its edges frayed, and its color a pale brown. She knew exactly what it was before even turning it over, because she had handled thousands just like it during her 5 years working in cafes. It was a cardboard coaster, the kind they used at Rosie's Cafe, was placed under every single cup. The Rosie's logo was almost completely faded, but you could still just barely see the stylized rose and the tiny letters underneath it. Lena turned the coaster over with fingers that were trembling so much she nearly dropped it. On the back, written in slanted blue ink, was her own handwriting. It was her name, Lena. She remembered the moment perfectly, like it was yesterday. It was the first day Jack had ever come into the cafe. She had scribbled her name on the coaster when he asked what it was, because the diner was packed and she had to run off to other tables. He had held on to it since that very first day, for 5 years. He carried it all the way from Boston to London and hid it behind a photo on his desk in a room he demanded be kept perfect, as if he planned to return any minute. Lena put the frame back exactly where she found it, the coaster now in her palm, feeling like it weighed nothing and everything all at once. She stood there in Jude Kensington's room, surrounded by the scent of wood and bergamot, holding a coaster with her name on it. And for the first time in 5 years, she let a thought she had pushed down deep inside finally come to the surface. Maybe he did not want to go. Maybe he never had a choice. At the end of the workday, as the setting sun painted the mansion's tall windows a deep red, Lena was called to Catherine's study. This room was different from the main living area, cozier and more intimate, with a huge wooden desk and bookshelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. Catherine was seated behind the desk. On it was a slim brown file, the type Lena knew you could not get from any public records office. Catherine did not offer her a seat. She did not have to. Lena understood this was not going to be a friendly chat. Lena Ashford, Catherine began to read, her voice flat and without any trace of emotion. Placed in the foster care system at age 3, lived with 4 different foster families over 13 years. Aged out of the system at 16, worked as a waitress at Rosie's Cafe in South Boston from age 21 to 22, left her job because of a pregnancy. Daughter, Phoebe Ashford, was born at Boston Medical Center. Currently lives at apartment 312, Maple Building, Dorchester. Annual income is below the federal poverty line. She shut the file. Everything matches up. Lena did not say a word. She just reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the coaster, and set it down on the desk right next to the file. Catherine's gaze fell, instantly recognizing the logo from Rosie's Cafe. She flipped the coaster over and saw the name Lena written in blue ink. For the first time since Lena had walked into her home, Catherine Kensington's composure completely shattered. It was only for a moment, a blink that lasted too long, a slightly deeper inhale, a swallow she could not hide. But Lena noticed it. "I found this in your son's room," Lena said softly, her voice steady. "It has my name, in my handwriting. He has kept it for 5 years. Catherine did not touch the coaster. She just stared at it, as if it were the last piece of a puzzle she had refused to solve for half a decade. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the Boston sky was shifting from a fiery red to a deep violet. 5 years ago, Catherine started, her voice transformed. It was no longer cold and sharp, but low and heavy, like someone opening a long-sealed box. Jude locked himself in his room for 3 days. He refused to eat, he would not speak to anyone, and he would not open the door, not even for me. She turned her eyes back to Lena. When he finally emerged, he said only one thing: "I have no reason left to stay." After that, he agreed to take the position at the London branch, an offer he had rejected for 2 straight years. He was on a plane that very week and has never come back. Catherine laid her hand on the coaster. Her fingers gently brushed over the name Lena, the same way her son did every single night before he fell asleep, thousands of miles away in London. I asked my husband Raymond if he knew what had happened with Jude. He told me he didn't, and I believed him. She took a breath. Now, I am certain he was lying. Looking straight into Lena's eyes, Catherine spoke in a tone that was impossible to read as either a command or a desperate request. "Bring the child here tomorrow. If she has Kensington blood, I will know." The bus ride back to Dorchester felt like it would never end. Lena sat in the very last row, her forehead pressed against the cold glass of the window. She watched Boston's cityscape glide by, but she did not really see any of it. Streetlights began to flicker on, and their yellow glow blurred through her tired eyes, looking like stars falling backward from the sky. Her hand stayed wrapped tightly around her phone in her apron pocket, as if it held the only evidence that today's events were real and not just some terrible waking dream. The bus finally stopped at the corner of Maple and Adams. Lena stepped off, taking a deep breath of the familiar evening air of her neighborhood. The smell of fried food floated over from the corner store. Hip-hop music poured out from a fifth-floor window somewhere overhead. The sound of children shrieking with laughter came from the small playground at the end of the block. She walked through the rusty iron gate of the Maple building and climbed 3 flights of stairs. The hallway lights flickered above her, looking like they were about to give out. She passed the spot on the second floor where the wall was peeling, a problem she had reported back in March that no one had bothered to fix. But the moment she opened the door to apartment 312, the entire outside world disappeared. Inside, the space was small and crowded, but every single corner was filled with the life of 2 people. Phoebe's colorful drawings were taped all over the refrigerator door. There were houses painted in impossible shades, flowers that were taller than people, and cats with wings soaring across purple skies. A small pot of mint sat on the windowsill. It was the only plant that had managed to survive the winter, all because Phoebe insisted on watering it each morning. The patchwork blanket that Dolly had sewn was draped over the old sofa. Every square of fabric held a story that the elderly woman would tell Phoebe on the nights she babysat. "Mama." Phoebe shot out of the living room like a tiny cannonball. Her light brown hair was a wild mess, and her fierce, familiar eyes were shining. In one arm, she clutched Biscuit, her stuffed bear that was worn thin and missing an eye, but was still her most precious treasure. Lena fell to her knees and pulled her daughter into a hug, holding on so tightly that Phoebe squealed, "Mama, I cannot breathe!" But Lena did not loosen her grip. She breathed in the scent of children's shampoo from her daughter's hair and felt those tiny arms wrap around her neck. For the first time all day, Lena felt like she was standing on solid ground. Dolly stood in the doorway, her knitting needles in her hands, watching them with a warm, gentle smile. "She was a good girl today. We practiced counting to 100 in Spanish." "Thank you, Miss Dolly," Lena said, doing her best to keep her voice from shaking. "You look exhausted," Dolly noted, peering over her reading glasses. "That first day working for the wealthy is always tough." "It was harder than I imagined," Lena admitted. It was probably the most honest thing she had said all day. After Dolly had gone, Lena started making dinner. It was scrambled eggs and toast, the meal Phoebe called breakfast at night, which always made her giggle because it felt so wonderfully backward. Lena sat across from her daughter at their small table, which was pushed up against the wall, and she just watched her eat. And suddenly, she could see everything. She saw the way Phoebe tilted her head when she chewed, which was exactly like Jude in that birthday picture. She noticed how she held her glass of milk with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, just like Jude holding his beer in the photo album. And then there was the dimple. That little dimple that appeared when she laughed. It was the one feature Lena had always assumed came from some far-off, unknown relative. But now it had a name, a face, and a portrait hanging on a living room wall in a grand mansion on Beacon Hill. Later that night, Phoebe was curled up asleep in their shared bed. Biscuit was tucked safely under her chin, and her mouth was slightly open, her breathing soft and steady. Lena lay next to her, wide awake. She quietly pulled out her phone, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened her photo gallery. She scrolled back in time, past hundreds of pictures of Phoebe, from the day she was born until now. She went past tired selfies taken after long night shifts, and past photos of instant noodles at 2 in the morning when Phoebe was just learning to roll over, until she finally found them. There were 4 pictures, the only things that remained of the 3 happiest months of her entire life. The first was a selfie taken in Boston, common, right when the leaves were changing color. Jude's arm was around her, and they were both smiling, with brilliant red maple trees blazing in the background. The second one showed Jude standing in the kitchen of this very apartment, the same kitchen where she had just cooked eggs. He was wearing a striped apron with a smear of tomato sauce on his cheek, grinning shyly after he had burned a pot of ramen. The third picture was blurry, and a little shaky because Lena had taken it in a rush. It was Jude kissing her forehead in the rain at Faneuil Hall, with raindrops sparkling in his hair and his gray-blue eyes closed. The fourth one was the last. It was a picture of Jude asleep on her sofa, one arm tucked under his head, his face looking so peaceful. Lena remembered thinking at that moment that she wanted to wake up to that face every morning for the rest of her life. 2 days after she took that photograph, he disappeared. Lena turned off her phone and just stared up at the ceiling. The crack was still there, a zigzag line running from the corner toward the middle of the room. It was exactly where it had been nearly 5 years ago, when she lay in that same spot, 7 months pregnant and all alone, not knowing what she would name her baby, or if she could even make the rent next month. She remembered the nights she would wake up at 3 in the morning to nurse Phoebe, her eyelids feeling heavy with exhaustion, but too scared to fall back asleep for fear her daughter might choke. She remembered the 8th month after Phoebe was born, when she had to go back to work while she was still breastfeeding. She would leave her baby with Dolly from morning until night, then come home to hold her and cry silently as the guilt just consumed her. She remembered the night Phoebe was 8 months old and burning up with a 104-degree fever. Lena had run 6 blocks barefoot through the freezing night to the emergency room at Boston Medical Center because she did not have enough money in her wallet for a taxi. She sang lullabies the whole way while her own tears soaked through her shirt. She had not cried since that night. It was not because she had no more tears left, but because she had learned that tears do not buy milk, they do not pay the rent, and they do not cure a sick child. She did not have the luxury of being weak. Phoebe did not allow her to be weak. And now, tomorrow morning, she was going to bring her 4-year-old daughter to meet a grandmother she never knew, into a mansion she could never have imagined, all to prove that the blood running through her veins belonged to a world that was millions of miles away from apartment 312 in the Maple Building. The next morning, Lena got up early and dressed. Lena dressed Phoebe in her nicest floral dress and carefully combed her hair, ignoring the little girl's complaints. "We are going to visit a woman at my workplace today," Lena explained, trying to sound as casual as possible. Phoebe tilted her head, her gray-blue eyes growing wide. "Will she have cookies?" Lena guided her daughter toward the back of the estate, deliberately avoiding the grand front entrance just as Catherine had demanded the day before. The flagstone walkway snaked through the southern garden, where the season's last hydrangeas displayed a faint violet hue before the harsh Boston winter arrived. Phoebe walked close to her mother, holding Lena's hand with one of her own and a biscuit in the other. Her curious eyes scanned everything with the boundless wonder of a child. "Mama, this house is huge," she said in a hushed tone, as if worried about being overheard. "Does somebody live in every room?" "Yes, my dear," Lena replied, her grip on Phoebe's hand tightening. The guest house was located at the garden's far edge. It was a two-story building, much smaller than the main house, but still 3 times bigger than their own apartment, in Dorchester. Catherine Kensington was already standing on the porch, waiting. She was dressed in a perfectly fitted cream suit, and her platinum hair was styled in an updo with not a single hair out of place. Her posture was perfectly straight. She was not, however, looking at Lena. Her attention was completely focused on Phoebe from the moment the two of them came into view at the start of the path. She stared at the child with a powerful intensity that Lena could sense from 20 paces away. Phoebe noticed it too. She stopped in her tracks, pulled on her mother's hand, and hid behind Lena's leg, clutching her worn toy even tighter. "Mama," she whispered, her gray-blue eyes blinking. "That lady is looking at me weird." Lena placed a comforting hand on her daughter's head, stroking her light brown hair. "It is all right, sweetie. She is just excited to meet you." Catherine had heard Phoebe's small voice, and Lena watched the older woman take a deep, slow breath before walking down from the porch. She approached them cautiously, each step measured, as if she feared any sudden movement might scare the child. When she was just a couple of feet away, she stopped and lowered herself, not quite kneeling, because Catherine Kensington would never kneel for anyone, but just enough to be closer to Phoebe's height. "Hello," she said, her voice much gentler than Lena had ever heard it. It was so soft that it was difficult to believe it belonged to the same woman who had made threats in the living room only a day ago. "You must be Phoebe." Phoebe gave a small nod, still mostly concealed by her mother's leg, but her inquisitive eyes peered out from around Lena's side. "Do you have any cookies?" Catherine blinked, and then a genuine smile formed on her lips, a sight Lena imagined very few people had ever witnessed. "I certainly do," she replied. "I have a great many cookies. Please come inside and I will get them for you." The guest house living room felt warmer than Lena had anticipated. There was a sofa with floral patterns, white lace curtains, and on the coffee table in the middle of the room sat a platter of freshly baked golden cookies. Next to it was a pitcher of apple juice and 3 glasses, 2 large ones and 1 small one. Catherine had prepared everything with great care, a gesture that spoke volumes to Lena. The moment she saw the cookies, Phoebe's shyness vanished. She looked to her mother for an okay. Lena nodded, and Phoebe climbed onto the sofa's edge, choosing a cookie and taking a tiny bite. Her entire face lit up with joy. "This is yummy," she announced with a big smile. A dimple appeared on her round cheek, a deep and unmistakable feature that was identical, down to the last detail, to the one in the photograph of Jude's birthday that Lena had looked at in an album the previous day. Catherine brought a hand to her chest, her fingers tightly gripping the material of her suit directly over her heart, and Lena noticed her knuckles turning white. "Jude adored these when he was a boy," Catherine said, her voice shaking. It was the first time Lena had ever heard it tremble. The words, "when he was a boy," came out filled with 40 years of longing and memory. Mrs. Cook made them for him every Sunday. He would always grab the biggest one and stuff it in his coat pocket to eat in his room. Phoebe was too young to grasp the weight of those words, but she could sense the kindness in the older woman's voice. She held out her half-eaten cookie as an offering. "Would you like a piece? It is really delicious." Catherine gently shook her head, but the smile never faded from her face. Her eyes were moist with tears, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Perhaps she was unable to. After eating her second cookie, Phoebe became more confident, beginning to explore the living room. She touched the fabric of the sofa, looked at the vase on the windowsill, And then she recalled the little backpack she had brought along. Mama, can I show her my drawings? Lena agreed, her heart beginning to pound inside her chest. She knew exactly what was in that book. Phoebe unzipped her backpack and took out a well-used sketchbook, its cover decorated with star and cat stickers. She climbed up on the sofa right next to Catherine, with a natural ease that surprised both women, and opened the book. The pages were filled with a child's crayon drawings. There was a house with smoke spiraling from its chimney, flowers as large as half the page, and a sun with a happy face. Catherine looked at every page, nodding and offering soft compliments, until Phoebe came to a specific drawing and paused. "This one is my favorite," she stated with the gravity only a 4-year-old can have. The picture showed 3 people holding hands. The shortest figure in the center, with brown hair and a floral dress, was clearly Phoebe. To the left was a taller person with long hair, her mother. To the right stood the tallest person, drawn with less detail, his hair short. He was positioned slightly apart from the other two, as if the artist was unsure just how near to put him. "This is Mama. This is me. And this," Phoebe said, pointing to the figure on the right, "is my daddy." Catherine stared at the drawing for a long moment, then turned her gaze to Phoebe. "Is your daddy very far from here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Phoebe nodded with a serious expression. "Very far. But Mama says he loves me very much. He just needed to go to a place that is very far away." Catherine then looked at Lena. Her eyes no longer held any of the coldness, the sharpness, the doubt, or the disdain that Lena had seen just the day before. Instead, her expression was filled with a mix of emotions that took Lena a moment to understand. There was respect, because Lena had taught her child that her father loved her instead of teaching her to resent him. There was sorrow, because she was meeting her 4-year-old granddaughter for the first time. And there was a profound sense of shame, the kind that can only come from a guilty conscience, because she was starting to realize that her family had deprived this little girl of something that no amount of cookies or grand houses could ever give back. Suddenly, the ringing of a phone broke the silence. Catherine pulled it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and her expression immediately changed. She stood up, said, "Please excuse me," and went out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. Lena could still hear her voice through the glass, quiet but firm. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "All right. No, do not ask questions. Just get back here." When Catherine came back inside, her calm demeanor had returned, but a fresh layer of stress was visible around her eyes. "There has been a development," she announced, looking directly at Lena. "Jude changed his flight. He is arriving tomorrow morning." Lena felt as if the ground was shifting under her. Tomorrow morning. Not over the weekend. Not in a week. Tomorrow. "I am not prepared for this," she said, the words escaping her before she could hold them back, a truer statement than any she had made in the past 2 days. Catherine observed her for a long moment. Then her gaze fell on Phoebe, who was now busy adding another yellow flower to her family portrait with a crayon, completely oblivious to the fact that her world was about to be turned upside down. "No one is ever prepared for something like this," Catherine said, her voice low. It was not a cold tone, but a heavy one, like someone bearing the weight of a monumental decision. "But my son has already lost 5 years. He will not lose another day." More than 5,000 miles away, in a suite on the 6th floor of Claridge's in central London, Jude Kensington was sitting by a window, gazing down at the midnight streets of Mayfair. A light rain created a soft blur on the glass, with tiny drops of water making their way down in random patterns, much like the life paths he had never taken. The whiskey tumbler on the marble windowsill was empty, with only a slight amber residue at the bottom and the faint smell of peat smoke still in the air. Next to the glass, on the cool stone, was a small, round piece of cardboard with frayed edges. It was a pale brown coaster from Rosie's Cafe, so old it was almost falling apart. Jude picked it up and flipped it over, looking at the slanted handwriting in blue ink. It had faded over time but was still easy to read. Lena. He ran his thumb across the name very gently, as if he were afraid that too much pressure would make it vanish, just like the woman with that name had vanished from his life. Or rather, the way he had forced her out of his life, telling himself it was for her own protection. The door opened. Brennan entered the room without knocking, a right he had earned after 10 years of service at Jude's side through secret negotiations, long nights, and choices that most people would never have to confront. He saw the coaster in Jude's hand, but showed no surprise, because this was not the first time he had seen it. It was not the 10th time, or even the 100th. "Boss, your mother called," Brennan said in an even voice. "She wants you to take an earlier flight tomorrow morning." Jude did not look up from the coaster. "Reason?" "She did not give one. She only said it is important and that she needs you home immediately." Jude stayed silent, his eyes completely focused on the small cardboard circle in his hand. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, watching his employer with the kind of patience that comes from having seen too much. He let out a soft, almost silent sigh. "It has been 5 years, boss," Brennan said. His voice was not accusing, just tired. It was the kind of weariness that comes from saying the same thing over and over, all while knowing the answer will never be different. "You should just let it go." Jude finally lifted his head. His gray-blue eyes, the very same eyes that a 4-year-old girl on the other side of the world had, though he did not know it, met Brennan's with a quiet sadness. "Brennan, I have let go of everything else in my life," he said, his voice low and slow. "I let go of my dream to become an architect when my father told me to take a seat at the director's table. I let go of the right to choose my own life on the day I took the Kensington name. I even walked away from the only woman who ever saw me for who I was, not for my money or my power or something to fear." His eyes moved down to the coaster. "Except for this. I could not let this go." Brennan stayed quiet. He had learned a long time ago that some arguments were not worth having, and the coaster with Lena's name on it was definitely one of them. Jude stood up and tucked the coaster into the inner pocket of his jacket, on the left side, right over his heart, the same place it had been for 5 years. It had been with him through every single board meeting, every stuffy formal dinner, and every long empty night in his London suite. "Book my flight for tomorrow morning," Jude said, walking past Brennan to the wardrobe to start packing. Brennan nodded and pulled out his phone. But just before he turned away, he took one last look at his boss. There he was, the most feared mafia boss on the entire East Coast, folding shirts into a suitcase with the same hands that just 12 hours before had signed off on a $200 million deal. He had to wonder if fate was playing some kind of sick joke, or if this was all part of a larger plan that started the moment Catherine Kensington decided to call her son back home. That very night, he sat staring at that same worn piece of cardboard. Jude had no idea. He did not know that across the city in Boston, inside a small apartment in Dorchester, a woman was also awake. She was also looking at old photographs and also counting down the hours. And he did not know that in 12 hours, the past he had fought to bury for 5 years would be standing inside his family's living room. It would arrive in the form of a 4-year-old child he never knew existed, a child who had gray-blue eyes that were identical to his own. That morning, Lena did not put on her uniform. She stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in her Dorchester apartment, looking at her face under the flickering fluorescent bulb. Then, she took the neatly folded housekeeper's uniform she had laid out on her bed and put it away. Instead, she reached for a simple black dress, the only piece of clothing in her closet that was not for work. She had found it on a sale rack at a thrift store 2 years earlier for an interview for a job she never got. The dress was old, but it still fit her well. The soft cotton skimmed her body. It was formal enough to not be embarrassing, but simple enough to let her feel like herself. She let her hair fall freely instead of tying it back the way she did every day. She looked at her reflection one final time, and then she turned away. If she had to confront Jude Kensington, she would do it as Lena Ashford, not as his housekeeper. The bus dropped her in Beacon Hill at 7:45 in the morning. The second she walked through the mansion's iron gates, she could feel that something was different. A shiny black Audi was parked by the main entrance, a car that had not been there 2 days ago. He was home. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the beat in her throat. She went directly to the main front door instead of using the staff entrance. Mrs. Patton opened it, her eyes widening for a moment at seeing Lena in a black dress rather than her uniform, but she did not ask any questions. She just nodded her head and stepped aside, as if she had been warned that this morning was going to be unusual. Lena walked across the marble foyer, the sounds of her low heels making steady echoes on the floor. She moved down the hallway she had memorized in just 2 days, past the oil paintings and crystal chandeliers, until she stopped right before the large double oak doors that led to the main living room. She could hear a man's voice coming from inside, deep and calm, and her entire body went rigid, as if she had been plunged into ice water. A chill shot down her spine. For 5 years, she had not heard that voice. For 5 years, she had told herself she had forgotten it. She was wrong. Lena knocked. "Come in," Catherine's voice answered, calm but stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. Lena pushed the door open. Catherine was seated in the usual armchair to the left of the fireplace, her back perfectly straight, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. And to the right of the fireplace, a tall man in a gray suit stood with his back to the door. He held a coffee cup in one hand, while the other was casually tucked in his pocket. He was saying something to his mother, his voice warm and steady. It was the voice of someone who had just come home from a long trip, completely unaware that the house had changed forever while he was away. Then he turned, and time stopped. Those eyes. It was the same, unforgettable, haunting look she had never been able to forget. 5 years had etched deeper lines into his face, making him look harder, more weary. A few flecks of silver now touched his temples, and his jaw was set tight, like a man who grinds his teeth at night. But his eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes she had gazed into every single morning for 3 months, and the same eyes she had seen every day since, on the face of her daughter. The coffee cup in Jude's hand tilted, almost falling. He managed to catch it just in time, but dark, scalding drops splashed onto his skin. He did not seem to feel it. His entire body froze solid. Only his eyes were alive, widening and blinking fast, as if his brain refused to accept what he was seeing. Lena. The name was a hoarse whisper, not even a real sound, just air forced from a throat that had suddenly clamped shut, as if saying her name had sucked all the oxygen from the room. Lena stood perfectly still, her arms down at her sides, her back straight, her eyes locked on his. She had mentally rehearsed this moment all night long, planning exactly what she would say. But now, standing in front of him, every practiced word disappeared. All that was left was the truth. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice far calmer than she felt. "Or maybe I should say, Jude Kensington, the crime boss whose real name I never knew." Jude set his coffee cup on the mantel, his hand shaking so much that it clinked against the hard marble. He looked at his mother, pure panic flashing across the face of the most powerful man on the East Coast. And in that moment, he looked like a little boy caught red-handed. "Mother," he said, his voice cracking right in the middle. "What is going on?" Catherine did not get up. She did not move a single muscle. Her posture did not change. Her expression remained completely blank. She just looked at her son with the eyes of a woman who had been preparing for this confrontation for 2 full days. And then she spoke, her voice so calm, it was cruel. As calm as someone reading the morning's weather report. As calm as if her words did not have the power to destroy everything in that room. "You have a daughter, Jude. She is 4 years old. Her name is Phoebe." A heavy silence fell. It was not an awkward silence or a thoughtful one. It was the silence in a room right after a grenade's pin has been pulled, but before it explodes. That one suspended second when everything is still whole, but everyone knows nothing will ever be the same again. Jude looked from his mother to Lena and then back to his mother. His mouth fell open, but no words came out. His right hand fumbled behind him until it found the back of an armchair, and he gripped it so hard his fingers turned white. All the color drained from his face, so much so that Lena could see the faint blue veins at his temple, and those gray-blue eyes, which only 12 hours before had stared out over the city with a familiar loneliness, were now wide with something much deeper than surprise. It was shock, a primitive kind of shock that makes the body forget how to work. Daughter, Jude repeated, the two syllables falling from his mouth like stones. 4 years. Catherine gave one firm nod. The woman standing before you is the child's mother. She came here looking for a job. She recognized your portrait on the wall, and I have spent the last 2 days verifying everything. Her story is true. Jude whipped his head toward Lena, his eyes desperately searching her face for some kind of denial, any sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Lena gave him none. She stood tall, her arms at her sides, and began to speak. Her voice was brief and cool. There was not a single tear, not a tremor, and no plea for pity. 6 weeks after you disappeared, I found out I was pregnant, she said. I looked for you. The phone number was disconnected. Nobody at the cafe knew you. All I had was a fake name and memories. I gave birth by myself at Boston Medical Center. No one held my hand in the delivery room. She paused, not for emotional effect, but just to take a breath. I have raised Phoebe all alone since then. The beginning. I worked 2 jobs every day. Some months, money was so tight I couldn't afford her formula, so I just didn't eat to make sure she had plenty. When Phoebe was only 8 months old, her fever shot up to 104 degrees in the middle of the night. I ran 6 blocks with bare feet to get to the emergency room because I did not have enough cash for a taxi. In December, every word felt like a knife, and Lena knew it. But she wasn't trying to hurt him. She was just telling him the facts, and the facts were painful enough. I did not come here looking for you, she said flatly. I had no idea who you were until I saw that portrait. I took the job because it pays 3 times more than the cafe, and my daughter needs to eat. That is the only reason. At some point, Jude had collapsed into the armchair. His elbows were on his knees and his hands were gripping his head. His back was hunched over, and his shoulders were shaking slightly. When he finally looked up, his gray-blue eyes were red and watery, not crying, but holding back a flood of tears. I did not know, he said, his voice completely broken. Lena, I swear I did not know. If I had known. What would you have done? Lena asked. She wasn't being bitter. She was genuinely asking. Jude looked at her, then stared down at his own hands, as if he could find the answer etched into his skin. He finally spoke, his voice low and heavy, like a man unearthing a painful memory he had buried for 5 years. My father found out about us, he said. Raymond Kensington does not like surprises. He had you followed. He knew every detail. Your home, your job, your entire schedule. Then he summoned me to his office. Jude had to force himself to swallow. He ordered me to end things right away. I told him no. The very next day you were let go from Rosie's. Lena winced at the memory. The owner had called her into the kitchen, avoiding her gaze while he explained the staff cuts. His voice was shaky, and she had taken his word for it, believing she was just another victim of bad luck. My father bought the whole building that the cafe leased, Jude went on, his words strained. He did it just to get you fired. Then he told me, this is just the beginning. If you don't listen, the next step will be much worse. I know my father, Lena. He doesn't make empty threats. He has the money, the connections, and the cruelty to follow through. His voice cracked on the final words. I left because I was terrified he was going to hurt you. I hoped that if I just vanished, he would finally leave you in peace. I thought it was the only way I could keep you safe. Catherine then added her thoughts, her voice somber. Raymond comes from a different world, she explained, gazing out the window at the morning sun. For men like him, family lines are everything. Your social standing is everything. I am not trying to defend my husband. I just need you to know that Jude made his choice under extreme pressure. Lena absorbed every word, letting each detail sink in. Inside her, two powerful emotions were clashing, unable to mix. The first was a deep-seated anger she had nurtured for 5 years, an anger toward the man who had disappeared and left her to fend for herself. But the other was a painful wave of understanding. He had not left because he fell out of love with her. He had left because he loved her so much that he was terrified for her. And that realization hurt far more than the anger ever did. "You never gave me a choice," Lena said, her voice now shaking with emotion. She was being torn apart by the anger and the understanding. "You decided on my behalf that I had to be abandoned to be protected. You thought you were being noble with your sacrifice. But do you have any idea what that sacrifice did to me? Or to your daughter?" Jude offered no reply. He just stared at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with a profound regret. It was not the shallow kind of regret you see when someone gets caught. It was the type that eats you alive from the inside, the kind he had lived with day and night in his London apartment, next to a coaster with her name on it. "Phoebe," he said, her name sounding broken as it left his lips. "Can I please see her?" Lena looked at him for what felt like an eternity. She examined those tear-filled gray-blue eyes that were identical to the ones her daughter looked at her with each morning while asking about breakfast. She saw the trembling hands of the most feared crime boss on the entire East Coast. She studied the man who had shattered her heart, but also given her the greatest gift she could imagine. "Yes," Lena finally answered. "But if you ever vanish again, Jude Kensington, I don't care who you are or how powerful you think you are. I promise you will not get a third chance." Jude drove with his eyes locked on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. Lena sat beside him, her hands in her lap, staring out the window. The car was completely silent. Boston's scenery shifted around them, from the charming brick streets of Beacon Hill to the busy avenues of downtown, and then into older, grittier, more authentic neighborhoods. 10 minutes ticked by, filled only with the sound of the engine and far-off car horns. Each second felt heavy as they both battled their own internal storms. Lena was the first to speak, not out of desire, but because the silence was becoming unbearable. "She loves to draw," she said quietly, her gaze still fixed outside. "Just like you." Jude glanced over at her, the first time he had done so since they left. "Like me?" "You wouldn't know," Lena said. "But Phoebe spends all day drawing houses, all different kinds. Houses with big gardens, houses with smoke coming from the chimneys, houses with balconies covered in flowers. She draws them so much. Her preschool teacher even asked me if I was an architect." She paused for a moment. "She draws houses as if she is looking for a place to call home but hasn't found it yet." Jude did not respond. He turned his attention back to the road, but Lena noticed the muscle in his jaw tighten. When the Audi pulled onto Maple Street, he slowed the car to a stop. He looked through the windshield at the building, taking in the rusted gate, the cracked steps, the graffiti-covered walls, and the clotheslines stretched between the fourth-floor windows. This was where his daughter lived. While he had been living in a luxury suite at Claridge's overlooking Mayfair, Phoebe was sleeping in a tiny apartment, sharing a bed with her mother, and holding a worn-out teddy bear named Biscuit. "I'm not feeling pity," Jude said softly as he shut off the engine, his eyes still on the building. "I'm feeling ashamed." Lena said nothing. She simply opened her door and got out of the car. Jude followed her. They walked up 3 flights of stairs in silence, passing by flickering lights in the hallway, walls with peeling plaster, and the smell of fried food coming from an apartment on the second floor. Jude never complained, or even winced. He just took it all in, his eyes cataloging every single thing his daughter had gone without for 4 years, because of his choice. Lena knocked on Dolly's door. As it swung open, a small brown-haired girl rushed forward before Lena could say a word. "Mama!" Phoebe threw her arms around her mother's legs, her face looking up with shining gray-blue eyes. And then she saw Jude. She froze. She cocked her head to one side, in the very same way Jude did when he was sizing up a situation, the same way she had looked at Catherine. Her curious eyes scanned up from his gleaming leather shoes all the way to his face, finally locking with his. Two identical sets of eyes met, like a mirror showing two different worlds. Then, Phoebe darted behind her mother's leg, squeezing her one-eyed teddy bear even tighter. "Mama," she whispered, "I don't like him." Lena gently placed a hand on her daughter's hair. "It's all right, sweetie." She gave Jude a look, and he knew exactly what it meant. He took one step back, and then another, giving the little girl her space. He didn't move forward or crouch down to try and talk to her. He did not do what an impatient grown-up might have done. He simply stood there and gave her time. Over in a corner of Dolly's living room, a small art table was set up. Phoebe went back to her little chair, pulled out her box of crayons, and started to draw, acting as if Jude wasn't even in the room. Jude looked over at Lena. She gave him a tiny shake of her head, a clear signal not to push it. He nodded, and then did something Lena never saw coming. He grabbed a small chair, sat down at the table right next to Phoebe, and picked up a clean sheet of paper and a couple of crayons. Then he started to draw. He did not say a word, did not even look at her. He just drew. He sketched a house with clean lines and perfect balance, complete with a columned porch, big windows, and wide front steps. There he was, a powerful crime boss on a little plastic chair in a Dorchester apartment, drawing the most amazing house you could create with just crayons. Phoebe peeked at him from the corner of her eye. She tried to pay him no mind, but a 4-year-old's curiosity is a powerful thing. She looked again, and then again. Finally, she gave up pretending and just stared. "Whose house is that?" she asked. Her voice was cautious, but her interest was clear. Jude looked up, his expression soft. "I'm not sure yet. I just enjoy drawing houses." "I like to draw houses too," Phoebe declared. And with that, the first connection between the father and daughter was formed. It was as light as air, but carried more significance than any business deal Jude had ever made. She scooted her chair a bit closer, and then a little more. She took out her sketchbook, opened it to a specific page, and set it down between them. It showed 3 people holding hands. Mama, Phoebe, and a third person standing a little off to the side, drawn with scribbled short hair. "Who is this one?" Jude asked, his voice almost a whisper. "That's my daddy," Phoebe replied with great seriousness. "Mama says Daddy went somewhere very far away, but I still make pictures of him." Jude had to turn his head away. His broad shoulders began to shake. Lena, who was watching from the doorway, saw him quickly raise a hand to his face, as if he were wiping away sweat. But it was not sweat. The most ruthless crime boss on the entire East Coast was crying over a picture drawn by a 4-year-old girl. Then Phoebe added softly, with the kind of unfiltered truth only a child can deliver. "Tommy has a daddy. Maya has a daddy. All the kids have a daddy." She looked down at her drawing. "I don't." The silence in the room was so thick you could barely breathe. And then Phoebe did something that no one was expecting. She carefully ripped the page from her sketchbook, smoothed it out on the table, and offered it to Jude with both of her small hands. "This is for you," she said, her tone completely serious, "because you seem sad." Jude accepted the paper with both of his hands. These were hands that had signed deals worth millions, that had held firm during life or death situations, that controlled a vast underground network. Now, they held a flimsy piece of paper as if it was the most delicate and valuable object he had ever touched. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked, completely on those 2 simple words. "This is the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me." On the ride home in the black Audi, the drawing sat on Jude's lap. He was silent for a full 5 minutes. Lena also said nothing, giving him the quiet he clearly needed. Finally, Jude spoke, his voice low and firm. It was no longer broken, but strengthened by a new feeling, something tougher than steel and more profound than sorrow. "I have lost 4 years," he said, his eyes fixed on the street in front of him. "I refuse to lose another single day." Jude was true to his promise. He visited the next day, and the day after that, and every day that followed. An entire month went by, and Jude Kensington never once missed a visit. He was never a minute late, even if it meant walking out in the middle of a board meeting, rescheduling a call with his partners in London, or battling Boston rush hour traffic to get to the Dorchester apartment at 4 o'clock, right on time. At first, Phoebe still called him Uncle Jude and always kept a safe distance from him, usually with her bear, Biscuit, sitting between them like a little fuzzy guard. But children have a special way of knowing who is genuine, and their judgment is more accurate than any tool adults could ever create. Phoebe could see it in his patience. She saw how he never made her talk when she was quiet, how he always sat on the rug so they could be at the same eye level, and how he remembered that she liked purple crayons more than blue ones, and that Biscuit needed his own spot at the table when it was time for cookies. Slowly but surely, the distance between them shrank. The worn-out stuffed animal went from being a barrier to being a friend they shared. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, there was Jude, sitting cross-legged on the faded rug of the Dorchester apartment, wearing a $3,000 suit and playing with Phoebe and a plastic tea set. The guest of honor, a silent bear, sat in his designated spot with a tiny pink cup in front of him. Phoebe carefully poured pretend tea into Jude's cup with the focus of a professional host. "Here is your tea," she announced. "I didn't put any sugar in it because you said you don't like it sweet." Jude took a sip from the tiny pink cup with the same serious look he had when signing contracts in front of his entire board. "It is perfect," he declared. "You make better tea than Brennan." Phoebe erupted in laughter, her cheeks showing deep, happy dimples. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her coffee and biting her lip to stop the overwhelming emotion from spilling out. And then, the day came. It was not a special day at all. It was just a normal Saturday afternoon. Jude had taken Phoebe and Lena to the grocery store because Phoebe really wanted a chocolate cereal that her mom never got because it was too expensive. They were going down the aisle. Phoebe was sitting in the shopping cart, her legs dangling and swinging, as her eyes took in all the colorful boxes on the shelves. She saw the cereal she wanted on a very high shelf. It had the cartoon bunny she loved, but it was too high for her and even for Lena to get. Without a second thought, without any hesitation at all, Phoebe turned to the tallest person near her and said, "Daddy, can you get that for me?" Jude froze right there in the aisle. His hand was already reaching for the box, his fingers just touching the cardboard, and he just stayed there, like a statue that had been stopped mid-action. His eyes filled with tears instantly. It happened so fast that Lena knew he had no time to prepare himself, to put up his defenses, or to put on his crime boss face. He was just standing in a busy supermarket holding a box of cereal with a bunny on it, his eyes glistening, and the word "daddy" was ringing in his ears like a bell he never knew he had been waiting his whole life to hear. "Daddy," Phoebe said again, confused about why he had stopped moving. "I want that box." Jude swallowed hard, blinked a few times, and then put the cereal into the cart. "Of course, Princess," he said. His voice was a little shaky, but his smile was the biggest one Lena had ever seen. Back at the mansion on Beacon Hill, Catherine Kensington was changing too. Every weekend, Phoebe would visit the estate, and the tough-as-nails matriarch, who had helped run a criminal enterprise alongside her husband for 40 years, would now sit on the floor and play dolls with her granddaughter. She showed Phoebe how to make things out of clay and told her stories about when Jude was a little boy. For the first time in a very long time, the sound of a child's laughter filled the halls that had long been quiet, heavy with power and secrets. Brennan was the first one to see the difference in Jude. One night, as Jude was leaving the Dorchester apartment after putting Phoebe to bed, Brennan was waiting by the car. He saw his boss walking toward him with a smile still on his face. "You are a different man, boss," Brennan remarked. Jude looked at him. "It's the way you smile," Brennan explained, not as a complaint, but with a sense of wonder. "I have worked for you for 10 years. I have never seen you smile that way." Jude did not reply, but he knew Brennan was telling the truth. He started to say no to certain kinds of meetings, the ones that were never on a calendar, the ones that happened in the basements of restaurants or the back rooms of clubs, the kind he used to attend without fail. He began to delegate his duties one by one, like someone carefully taking apart a tower he had spent 15 years building. He was dismantling it from the very top, slowly, but with absolute resolve. And on the refrigerator in the Dorchester apartment, in the most prominent spot, was Phoebe's latest drawing, held up by a flower-shaped magnet. It showed 3 people holding hands. Mama was on the left, Phoebe was in the middle, and Daddy was on the right. This time, he was not off in a faraway corner, and he was not a faint sketch at the side of the page. Daddy was standing right beside them, holding his daughter's hand and holding Mama's hand. He was big and clear and there, colored in with the darkest black crayon from the box. It was as if Phoebe was making completely sure that this time, Daddy was not going to fade. The picnic had been Jude's idea. He brought it up on a Friday night while the 3 of them were sitting on the floor of the Dorchester apartment, eating pizza because their table was too small for all 3 of them. Phoebe had called it the greatest pizza party ever, even though it was just a $12 pizza from the local shop. "The weather is supposed to be nice tomorrow," Jude said, looking over at Lena. "We could go to Walden Pond, the 3 of us, if you want to." Lena paused for a moment. It would be their first real outing as a family, not in the safe confines of the apartment or the protected estate, but out in the open world, where anyone might see them and think they were just a normal family. "Okay," she agreed. On Saturday morning, the black Audi drove out of Boston, heading west. Phoebe was strapped into the car seat Jude had purchased the week before, holding Biscuit on her lap and talking nonstop. She told them about her preschool classmate Tommy, who had just lost a baby tooth. She talked about her teacher, Miss Teresa, who taught her how to finger paint butterflies. And she mentioned how Dolly was knitting a new winter hat for Biscuit, because bears get cold too. Jude drove, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to watch his daughter, answering all her questions and nodding at all the right times. He acted surprised whenever her stories called for it. Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching them both in the same mirror, a warmth spreading through her that she was not yet ready to name. Then, right in the middle of her story about butterflies, Phoebe asked a question as casually as if she were asking about the sky. "Daddy, why weren't you and Mama together when I was born?" An immediate silence filled the car. Lena felt like she could not breathe. Her hands clenched the seat. In the mirror, she saw Jude's grip on the steering wheel tighten. His jaw was set, but he did not avoid the question. He did not change the topic or say she would understand when she was older. "Because Daddy made a very big mistake," Jude said, his words slow and measured, as if he were treading on thin ice. "Daddy thought that leaving would keep Mama safe, but all it did was make her sad, and it meant Daddy missed a lot of time with you." Phoebe was quiet for a moment, thinking it over in the way only a 4-year-old can. Then she said, "But Daddy is here now." "Yes," Jude replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy is here now, and Daddy is never going away again." "Right. Never ever. Pinky promise?" Jude looked into the rearview mirror. Phoebe had her tiny little finger raised, looking completely serious. As if he were taking part in a sacred ceremony, he reached back with his right hand and hooked his finger around hers. His large, rough finger gently wrapped around her small one with a tenderness only a father can have. "Pinky promise," Jude said. Walden Pond on a fall morning was so breathtaking it almost looked fake. The lake was perfectly still, creating a mirror image of the blue sky and the trees that were changing from green to gold and fiery red. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. They laid out Dolly's quilt under a large oak tree near the water and set up the food Jude had picked up from a deli on the way. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, and a box of cookies that Phoebe had insisted on, saying, "These are the special ones Grandma Catherine gives me. They're the best." After they ate, Phoebe pulled out the watercolor set Jude had given her and sat at the edge of the blanket, painting a picture of the lake. She was completely focused, with her head down and her tongue sticking out a little, while the two adults leaned back against the tree trunk, their shoulders close but not quite touching, watching her. "Lena," Jude said, and his voice was different now. He was no longer a father talking to his child, but a man talking to the woman he loved, his voice low and shaky. "I want a second chance." Lena kept her eyes on Phoebe, who was busy mixing blue and white paint to get the color of the water just right. "It is not just because of Phoebe," Jude went on. "Even though she is the most important reason, it is because of us. Because what we had never really went away." He stopped for a moment, then said more quietly, almost to himself, 5 years, Lena. 5 years. I kept that coaster with your name on it in my jacket pocket. I carried it from Boston to London and put it on my nightstand every single night. Brennan thinks I am crazy. He offered a sad little smile. Maybe I am. But I met a lot of people in those 5 years, and none of them, not a single one, was you. Lena finally turned and looked at him. His gray-blue eyes met hers with pure, unguarded honesty. There was no tough guy armor, no walls around his heart. Just the man she had loved 5 years ago, sitting under an oak tree by a lake, asking her for a chance. "I am scared," she admitted, more honestly than she had ever spoken before. "I am scared of your world, Jude. It is so dangerous. It took you away from me once. It could take you away again, or even worse, it could hurt Phoebe." Jude did not try to argue with her or make big promises he could not keep. He did not offer any empty words of comfort. He just said, "Do not believe my words. Watch what I do. I will prove it to you every single day." Before Lena could say anything, Phoebe came running up to them, holding her painting, which was still a little wet. Her eyes were sparkling. "Look," she shouted, holding it up between them. It was a picture of a blue lake and trees with red and gold leaves. In the middle, 3 little figures were standing next to each other at the edge of the water. It was not like her old drawing of 3 people holding hands with the daddy far off in a corner. This time, all 3 of them were standing shoulder to shoulder. Above their heads, in messy letters, Phoebe had just learned how to write one single word: family. Lena looked at the painting, then at Phoebe, and then at Jude. She put her hand on top of his, slowly and gently, but without any hesitation. It was the first time in 5 years she had reached out to him. "One step at a time," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "But together." Jude turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They sat there under the oak tree, watching Phoebe run toward the lake, chasing a butterfly in the late autumn sun. Painting that said family rested between them on the colorful blanket. On the ride home, Phoebe fell asleep in the back seat, with a biscuit tucked under her chin. Her lips were slightly parted, and her breathing was soft and steady. The Audi moved smoothly down the highway as the Boston skyline appeared ahead, painted in the violet and red colors of twilight. Lena and Jude's hands were still locked together over the gear shift. Nobody said a word. They did not need to. For the first time in 5 years, the silence between them was not filled with loss, anger, or loneliness. It was a silence of peace, the kind of quiet that comes when 2 people have finally found their way back to one another. The week after the picnic was so perfect that Lena started to get scared. It was not the old fear of not having enough or being alone that she was used to. It was a fear of being happy. She was afraid because every morning Phoebe would run to the door the second she heard the bell. She would yell, "Daddy!" and throw herself at Jude's legs like a little cannonball. Her smile was so big. Lena knew that if that smile was ever taken away, it would break Phoebe in a way that 4 years without a father never could. Because this time, she would know exactly what she was losing. She was afraid because each morning, Lena would make coffee for Jude, black with no sugar, and place the cup on the small kitchen table. He would take the first sip and look at her with those gray-blue eyes that had captured her heart 5 years ago, and she knew she was falling for him all over again. She was afraid because Catherine Kensington, the tough-as-nails head of the family, invited all three of them for dinner in the main dining room of the Beacon Hill mansion. They were not in the guest house or hidden away in a private corner. They were at the main table, where every important Kensington dinner had been held for the last 50 years. Phoebe sat in a high chair that Catherine had bought just for her, and Biscuit, her teddy bear, had his own seat right next to her because she insisted he needed a place too. And Catherine did not say a single word of protest. It was an act of acceptance that was clearer than any official announcement could have been. Everything was perfect. And Lena was afraid because life had taught her that beautiful things never last. Then she saw the sport utility vehicle. The first time was on Tuesday when she was picking Phoebe up from her preschool. A black sport utility vehicle with dark-tinted windows was parked across the street, about 30 meters from the gate. Lena did not think anything of it at first. Boston was full of tinted sport utility vehicles. But on Thursday when she got there again, the same vehicle was there. It was in the same spot, with the same license plate. This time, the driver rolled the window down just a little, enough for Lena to see a man's face staring right at the preschool gate where Phoebe was running out, hugging her favorite stuffed toy. Lena grabbed her daughter's hand a little tighter and started walking faster, her heart hammering in her chest. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just another parent waiting for their child. But the survival instinct she had developed over 27 years without a safety net was screaming at her that something was very wrong. That night, Dolly knocked on her apartment door. The gentle smile Lena was used to seeing on her 68-year-old neighbor's face was gone. She looked worried. "Someone came asking questions today," Dolly said in a low voice. "While you were at work, a man in a suit with perfectly combed hair came by. He was very polite, but it was a fake kind of polite. He asked where the little girl goes to school, what time you pick her up, and if anyone else ever gets her." All the color drained from Lena's face. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I did not know," Dolly answered, her eyes looking sharp. "I have been around long enough to know when you should not answer a stranger's questions." Lena locked the door and then checked it again. She peeked into the bedroom where Phoebe was sleeping soundly with Biscuit, then took out her phone and called Jude. He was there in less than 15 minutes. But the man who walked into her Dorchester apartment that night was not Daddy Jude. He was not the man who sat on the floor and drank pretend tea from a tiny pink plastic cup. This man was completely different. His face was cold, his jaw was clenched, and his gray-blue eyes looked as hard as steel that had been forged in fire. This was Jude Kensington, the boss. The man the entire East Coast knew you did not mess with. He listened without interrupting as Lena told him every single detail. The sport utility vehicle, the man asking Dolly questions. Then he made one phone call to Brennan. "Check it. Black sport utility vehicle, tinted windows, near the preschool on Adams. I am sending you the plate number. Find out who is asking about my daughter." His voice was not loud, but every word he spoke carried a weight that made Lena shiver. She was not afraid of him, but she was afraid of the world he was a part of. A world that was now reaching its dirty hands toward her child. The answer came before midnight. Brennan called back, and she could hear the tension in his voice. "It is Vincent Corsetti's men, a rival from New York trying to put pressure on Jude over some territory. They found out Jude had a daughter and an old flame. They found his weakness. She was perfect to use as leverage, a 4-year-old orphan from Dorchester with no one to protect her." Lena listened as Jude spoke to Brennan on the phone. She could not grasp all the words, but she understood enough. Her daughter had been turned into a pawn in a game between mob bosses. A raw anger, stronger than any fear she had ever felt, surged through her. "This," Lena said, her voice shaking with fury, not fear, after Jude hung up. "This is what I was afraid of. It is exactly what I warned you about at the lake. Your world is a dangerous place, and you have dragged us right into the middle of it." "Lena, Phoebe is 4 years old," she whispered with intensity, mindful that her daughter was asleep in the other room, but her voice was sharp enough to cut. "4 years old, Jude, and now someone is watching her. They are asking questions about her. They know her school and the exact time I pick her up. All because of you, because of your name, Kensington, and the empire you command." She took a step back, a small movement that created a massive gulf between them. "My daughter will not be a hostage in your war, Jude Kensington. I have spent my entire life on my own, and I can do it again. I will take Phoebe and leave Boston if that is what it takes. I have been running my whole life. I know how to do it." Jude did not say, "I will take care of it," or, "You have to trust me." He offered none of the hollow promises Lena had heard from so many others. He just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes as cold and hard as steel. He gave a single sharp nod, then turned and walked out of the apartment. The door clicked shut behind him. Lena stood frozen in her living room, her hand pressed to her chest. As she listened to his footsteps disappear down the old staircase, she had no idea that in the next 12 hours, Jude Kensington would tear down everything he had spent 15 years building. The moment he was in the car, he made his first call. He did not call Brennan. He dialed Vincent Corsetti directly. Brennan, who was driving, stared at Jude as if he had gone insane when he heard the calm, chilling tone in Jude's voice. "Vincent, this is Jude Kensington. That South Boston territory deal you wanted? I am giving it to you, all of it. I have only one condition. My family is off limits. Starting right now, if any of your men even come near my daughter or her mother again, this will no longer be a negotiation. It will be war, and you know I do not make empty threats." Corsetti took the deal. Of course he did. The South Boston territory was worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had just won it without a single drop of blood. But Jude was not finished. His second call went to Daniel Whitfield, a corporate lawyer. He was not a mob attorney who buried secrets in paperwork. He was the kind of lawyer who wore crisp white shirts and worked in glass towers downtown, handling legitimate business transfers. "Daniel, I need to see you tonight, right away. I want to sign the papers to transfer all unofficial operations of Kensington Holdings to the Executive Council. Every last bit of it. I am walking away completely." The silence on the phone line was long. Jude knew Daniel was trying to figure out if he had heard him correctly. "Are you sure? We are talking about the entire network." "All of it," Jude confirmed. Brennan drove him to the law firm in complete silence. But as Jude opened the car door, Brennan finally spoke up. "Boss, that is 15 years of your life. That is the empire you built with your own 2 hands, all while living under the weight of your father's expectations." Jude paused with one foot on the pavement and glanced back over his shoulder. "Everything I ever built," he stated, his voice quiet but filled with total conviction, "is asleep in an apartment in Dorchester, holding a teddy bear named Biscuit." Brennan stared at him for a long moment before nodding once. He said nothing else. 3 hours later, Jude had signed away everything. Every document, every transfer, every last agreement. When he walked out of the law office at 2 in the morning, he was no longer the most powerful mob boss on the East Coast. He was just Jude Kensington, a 36-year-old man who owned a legitimate real estate and casino company, and the father of a 4-year-old girl whose first 4 years he had missed. But he did not go straight to Lena's apartment. He went back to his mansion, into his private study. He opened a desk drawer and removed a rolled-up tube he had hidden there for weeks. He had it before the picnic, before he had even allowed himself to hope. It was a set of architectural drawings, the first project he had designed himself since giving up his dream of being an architect 15 years ago. At 3 in the morning, Jude was standing outside apartment 312 in the Maple building in Dorchester. He had dark circles under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his hair was a mess from running his hands through it all night. In one hand, he held the transfer documents. In the other, he held the roll of blueprints. He knocked gently on the door. Lena answered, her eyes dark from a sleepless night. She was still in her clothes from the day before. She had clearly been waiting up, or maybe trying to decide where she would run. She looked at him, and he looked at her. Jude then placed the stack of papers on her kitchen table. "They are transfer papers," he said. "I signed them all. All of the underground businesses have been transferred to the council. I am completely out. Kensington Holdings is now a legitimate company. Real estate, casinos, and investments. It is all clean." Lena glanced at the papers but did not pick them up. She looked back at him, her expression still guarded. But underneath that guard was something else, something she was trying hard to hide. It looked a lot like hope. Jude unrolled the blueprints, spreading the large sheet over her small kitchen table. He used a coffee mug and a salt shaker to hold down the edges because the table was too small. The design came to life under the flickering, fluorescent light. The lines were clean, precise, and beautiful. They showed the skill of formal training, but were drawn with an open heart. It was a brownstone house in Brookline, with 2 stories and a red brick front. Inside, on the first floor, was a studio with large, north-facing windows, the kind of light a graphic designer dreams of. On the second floor was a child's art room with white walls perfect for hanging up drawings, and a small easel sat by the window. Outside, in the backyard, was a young oak tree with a swing. "This is my first project," Jude said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I wanted to be an architect before my father made me into something else. This was the dream I buried. I am digging it back up now." He pointed to each part of the house. "A studio for you. It has north light, exactly what you need for your design work. An art room for Phoebe, with white walls she can fill with her drawings. A backyard with a swing, because last week she asked me why our house does not have one. Jude, I am not trying to buy your love with a house," he added quickly, as if he was afraid she would get the wrong idea. "This is a promise. It is a promise that I am ready to build our entire life over again from the beginning. Clean, with no shadows, no criminal underworld. Just me, you, and Phoebe." Lena stared at the drawing. Her fingers traced the lines of the studio, where he had even sketched in a desk and a wide window. Her hand moved to the small art room, where he had placed Phoebe's easel in the spot with the very best light. Her hand was trembling. "Do you know what scares me the most?" she whispered. "It is not being poor. I have been poor my whole life, and I have always managed. It is not being alone. I have always been alone, and I am still here." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears she would not let fall. "The thing I am most afraid of is not belonging anywhere. My whole life, I went from one foster home to another, from one rented room to the next. I have never had a place that felt like home. No one has ever looked at me and said you belong here and really meant it." Jude took a slow, gentle step toward her, the same way he had approached Phoebe when they first met, giving her space to move away if she wanted to. She did not move. "You belong here," he said, his voice deep and steady, yet trembling at the same time. "Both of you belong here." Lena looked at him, at his gray-blue eyes, shadowed from a sleepless night. She saw his wrinkled suit, worn from hours spent in a law office signing away his entire empire, at the blueprint for a home, a design that came from a dream he had held onto for 15 long years. She then moved closer and laid a hand on his chest, right over the inner pocket where the coaster with her name had been for 5 years. She could feel his heart hammering against her palm. He was the mafia boss, the architect, the father of her little girl, the man who had torn down an empire for a 4-year-old and for the woman he had always loved. That first kiss after 5 years was so light it was almost not there. Just a meeting of breath, a brushing of lips, both of them hesitant and shaking, as if to see if something so broken could ever be whole again. But then the kiss grew deeper, more confident, more certain, and 5 years of being alone, 5 years of resentment, 5 years of a love buried under layers of self-protection, all of it dissolved right there in that little kitchen, under the hum of a flickering light, between the legal papers and the drawing of a dream home. When they finally separated, both of them had tears in their eyes. "That's a yes, isn't it?" Jude whispered. Lena smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen, with no walls up, no defenses, just her. "This means, let's build it together," she answered. The brownstone in Brookline was finished on a crisp autumn morning, just as the last leaves on the maple trees were shifting from a fiery red to a deep copper. The red brick of the house seemed to glow in the soft sunlight. Its large windows were like mirrors, reflecting a perfectly clear blue sky. In the backyard, a young oak tree clung to its last few yellow leaves, as if it wanted to greet the new family with its most beautiful colors before the winter came. Phoebe was the one to walk through the door first. She stopped right in the entryway with her teddy bear, Biscuit, held tightly under her arm. Her eyes, a perfect reflection of his, grew so big they seemed to take up her whole face. And then she let out a squeal, a sound of pure happiness that only a child can make, a sound that isn't held back by any kind of caution. "My room! Mama! Daddy! Where is my room?" Jude took her hand and led her up the stairs. When he pushed open the door to the art room, Phoebe just froze. The walls were bright white. A small easel stood by the window, perfectly placed to catch the morning sun. A brand new box of crayons and a set of watercolors were sitting neatly on a shelf. And over in the corner was a little wooden bed that Jude had made himself, sized just right for a stuffed bear. Phoebe looked from the little bed to Biscuit, and then back to her daddy. Her eyes shining with joy, she gently set Biscuit down on his new bed, tucked the tiny blanket all the way up to his neck, and then looked at Jude with the most serious face a 4-year-old could possibly make. "Biscuit has his own room now," she declared. Jude knelt to her level and pulled her into a hug. Lena stood watching them from the doorway, holding on to the frame because her legs felt shaky, not from sadness, but because her heart was fuller than it had ever been in her 27 years. Later that afternoon, the doorbell chimed. Catherine Kensington was standing on the porch. She was dressed in a chic, light gray suit, her platinum hair styled perfectly, looking as flawless as ever. But she was holding something Lena never would have anticipated. It was an old silver picture frame, heavy and covered in detailed carvings. It was clearly a family heirloom, not something you could buy in a store. The picture inside was the one Catherine had arranged for just last week at her mansion. It showed Phoebe sitting in the green velvet armchair in the grand living room with Biscuit on her lap. She was smiling, her dimples showing, in the very first official portrait of a Kensington granddaughter. Catherine gave the frame to Lena. Then, she rested a hand on Lena's shoulder. She said nothing at all. She didn't have to. The gentle weight of her hand, just firm enough to be comforting, but light enough to respect the delicate boundaries they had been building for weeks, spoke louder than any formal words of acceptance ever could. Catherine came inside and stayed for an hour in the art room with Phoebe. She showed her how to mix blue and white paint to create clouds, and told her that Jude used to love painting clouds when he was a boy, because he always said they were the one thing nobody could ever own. When it was time for Catherine to leave, she didn't use the front door. She walked out through the backyard, stopping for a moment under the young oak tree to look back at the house. A light was on in the second-floor window. Phoebe's little shadow danced behind the curtain. The sound of her laughter drifted out into the cool autumn air. Catherine remained there for a while, all by herself, the hardened matriarch's face softened by the warm glow from the window. And for the very first time in many, many years, she smiled. It was a private smile, not for anyone else to see, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you have finally done the right thing after years of watching things go wrong. Then she walked away, her footsteps barely making a sound on the stone path that led to the back gate, stepping out of a picture that she understood was now complete without her. That evening, after Phoebe had her bath and was in the star-covered pajamas Catherine had given her, Jude tucked her into bed. Phoebe snuggled down under the covers of her new bed, grabbed Biscuit from his little stand to sleep with her, and then gazed up at her dad. "Daddy, this is our house, right?" "Yes, Princess. This is our house for always." "For always." She smiled, that little dimple appearing, as her heavy, silvery blue eyelids began to close. Within moments, her breathing grew soft and even. It was the deep sleep of a child who finally had her very own room, a daddy, a mama, and a real home. Jude watched over her for a good while before he went downstairs. He carefully unrolled the painting Phoebe had made at Walden Pond, the one with the 3 stick figures holding hands by the water, with the word family written above them. He hung it on the living room wall, in the most important spot where it would be the first thing anyone saw. Next to it, he hung a small glass frame. Inside was the old, worn coaster from Rosie's Cafe. The Rose logo was faded, and on the back, the name written in slanted blue ink was now blurry with time, Lena. The coaster was now safe behind glass. After 5 years in his pocket, after thousands of nights sitting on a bedside table in London, after his thumb had traced its letters in the dark more times than he could count, it had finally found its final home. It was no longer a painful reminder of what was lost, no longer a proof of his failure, but the very first page of their new story. Lena was standing by the window in her first-floor studio, the room Jude had designed just for her. The large, north-facing window allowed the moonlight to pour in, creating a silver path across the new hardwood floor. She stood there, a hand pressed against the cool glass, looking out into the backyard where the swing set swayed gently in the evening breeze. Jude came up quietly behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. They just stood there together in the moonlight, listening to the wind, to the faint creaks of the new house settling in, and to the rhythmic sound of Phoebe's breathing coming from the baby monitor Jude had set up on the very first day. "We lost 5 years," Lena whispered. Jude held her just a little tighter. "But we have a whole lifetime left," he replied. And that is where the story concludes, right here in the brownstone in Brooklyn, where a coaster with Lena's name on it sits in a frame next to a child's crayon drawing of her family. Where a stuffed bear named Biscuit has his very own bed. Where a man who was once a mafia boss tore down his old world to build a new one with a swing for his daughter. And where a 27-year-old orphan finally has a place to call her own. Life can take so much from us. It can take our time. It can take our opportunities. It can take the people we care about most. But sometimes, if we can find the courage to open our hearts one more time, find the strength to forgive, and find the patience to trust in actions over words, miracles can happen. They might be late, but they are never too late. If this story resonated with you, please show your support for our channel by hitting the like button so we can continue to share stories just like this one. Share this video with the people you love or with anyone who needs a reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, love and honesty will always find their way home. And please remember to subscribe so you never miss out on new, heartfelt stories we share every single day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lost and then found someone again? Or maybe you are on your own journey, still searching for your place to belong, just like Lena? Please share your own stories in the comments section. We truly read every single one, and we want to know what is on your mind and in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, abundant joy, and peace in your everyday lives. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.